Elderly man humiliated at luxury restaurant. Then the CEO walks in and changes everything. Before we get into this story, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And if you enjoy stories like these, make sure to subscribe, as we upload at the same time every day. James Carter could feel the tension the moment he stepped through the tall glass doors of Maison Lauror, one of the most prestigious restaurants in the city. It was his 72nd birthday, and he had arrived a little early, hoping to surprise his daughter and grandson with a warm welcome before they joined him. Yet in the first few seconds he sensed something was off. A couple of waiters exchanged looks. A hostess watched him as though he'd wandered in from the wrong side of town. That was the first red flag, and it struck him as particularly painful because he remembered all too well how these subtle hints of disrespect could escalate quickly. Decades ago, he taught about systemic biases and hidden prejudices in his sociology classes, never imagining he'd still face them head-on at his age. He knew better than to make assumptions outright, so he simply straightened his shoulders, placed a gentle hand against the front of his press blazer, and approached the sleek granite podium where the hostess stood. "Good evening," he said, voice steady, hoping his warm tone would be met with at least some courtesy in return. The hostess eyed him up and down, lips tightening. She had that kind of practiced, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome to Maison Lauror," she said. "Do you, have a reservation?" Her hesitation was almost comical, as though the mere possibility of him having a reservation was too outlandish to consider. James nodded and provided his name, carefully articulating each syllable in case she claimed not to understand. He explained that his daughter, Lisa Carter, made the reservation for 6 o'clock. The hostess tapped a tablet with manicured nails, scanning the list, then paused. Her eyes flicked back up at him, somewhat dismissively. "I'm sorry," she said in a rehearsed tone. "I'm not seeing that name here." Immediately, James reached for his phone, certain Lisa had texted him earlier confirming the date and time. He offered to show the confirmation email, but before he could, the hostess let out a small sigh. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding," she said, but the look on her face told him she wasn't sorry at all. James stepped aside, trying to remain composed, and dialed Lisa's number. He could feel heat spreading through his cheeks, not anger, exactly, but a tense sort of embarrassment. He couldn't help noticing that behind him, a younger, impeccably dressed couple in designer clothes walked in, greeting the staff with familiarity. They admitted they didn't have a reservation either, but the hostess was quick to seat them, leading them beyond a curtained entryway toward the best table on display. The contrast was glaring, and James felt a knot form in his stomach. Lisa picked up her phone and confirmed that she'd definitely booked the table online. "Dad, are you sure you're at the right restaurant?" she asked, half joking. Yes, I'm at Maison Lauror," he said, trying to sound calm. "They're telling me they can't find the reservation." Lisa double-checked her emails. She forwarded him the confirmation. James hung up, resolved to show the hostess the proof. But when he returned to the podium, the woman was busy seating another party that had just walked in off the street. Eventually, the hostess turned back to him with a practiced expression. "Sir," she said, "did you get a chance to check if you're booked for tonight or another night?" It was exactly the sort of question that implied it was more likely his own error than theirs. James forced a small, polite smile. "I have the email right here." He extended his phone to her, showing the date, time, and name of the restaurant. It was plain as day: Lisa Carter, party of 3, 6 o'clock reservation. The hostess stared at the screen for a moment, and for just a flash, James swore he saw a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "Let me get the manager," she finally said, as though that were the last thing she wanted to do. Minutes ticked by. James found himself standing awkwardly in the foyer, his phone still open to the email, watching more customers come in. Each time, the hostess greeted them with a warmer smile, deftly leading them inside. He felt invisible, and that was far worse than hearing outright slurs or direct insults. It was the casual disregard that stung, the insinuation that he did not belong, that no one needed to hurry to accommodate him. James shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to muster patience, reminding himself that an outburst wouldn't solve anything. He glanced at his watch, noticing that Lisa and his grandson, Jordan, would arrive any minute. He wanted to spare them this nonsense if he could, but it seemed that chance was dwindling. The manager, a tall man with slicked back hair and an overly tight suit, finally showed up. He glanced at James, then at the hostess, who began whispering something. James heard a few snatches. "Wrong name," and "I think he's confused," and his patience was wearing thin. The manager gave James an up-and-down look, scanning from his carefully polished shoes to his modest blazer. There was a slight smirk, a kind of condescension that prickled James's nerves. "Sir," he said with a faint air of superiority, "can I help you?" The way he emphasized "you" suggested James was the only problem here. James took a breath. "My daughter made a reservation for 6," he explained, again showing the confirmation on his phone. The manager barely glanced at it. "We're pretty full tonight," he said. "You must have made a mistake." James tried to keep his composure. "The mistake," he said calmly, "is that I'm being treated like I'm not supposed to be here." The manager's eyes narrowed a fraction. "What are you implying?" His tone was frosty, but that question hung in the air, loaded with subtext. James decided not to push it yet. "I'm simply stating the facts," he replied. "I have a confirmed reservation. Yet 2 other parties who walked in without one were seated right away." The manager's nostrils flared slightly, his posture stiffening. "We see people based on availability. Sometimes, if there are no shows, or if tables open up for smaller parties, we accommodate walk-ins." It was a polished excuse that might have passed muster under different circumstances, but James had been watching. Every time a newcomer walked in, the hostess found a table. Yet for James, there was apparently not a single chair to spare. Just then, the large glass doors swung open, and Lisa and Jordan rushed inside, breathless. "Dad," Lisa said, giving him a hug. She looked at the manager and hostess, and back at James. "What's going on?" Jordan, tall for his 16 years, eyed them all suspiciously. "We're late because the traffic was insane," Lisa apologized. "But the reservation is for 6, so we should still be good." The hostess spoke up in an almost reprimanding tone. "You are quite late, actually. We might have given your table away." Lisa looked at her watch. "We're 3 minutes past 6, she said in disbelief. "And my father was here even before that. How could you possibly give away our table?" The manager forced a saccharine smile. "We didn't see him checked in properly, so we assumed it was a no-show." Jordan's eyes flicked between the manager and the hostess, picking up on tension. He pulled up the reservation email on his own phone to double-check. "This is exactly the right place, right time." Lisa turned her phone screen toward the manager. "Here is the confirmation," she said, her voice getting tighter. "So now, can we be seated?" The manager pursed his lips, almost as if it pained him to concede. The hostess glanced away. "We're quite full at the moment," the manager repeated. "There might be a wait." Jordan scowled. "Why can't we have the table we reserved in advance?" The manager rolled his shoulders in a shrug that dripped condescension. "As I said, we gave it away since you were late." Lisa nearly choked on her disbelief. "We were 3 minutes late," she stressed. "Is that standard policy to cancel a reservation after 3 minutes?" The manager shrugged again, eyes drifting to the side. The awkward silence was broken by a nearby waiter who was in the middle of cleaning a table. He glanced over, looking visibly uncomfortable. James noticed that the waiter's expression was full of sympathy. Lisa's face reddened in anger, but James rested a hand on her shoulder. "We'll wait," he said, trying to be the voice of reason. "Just tell us how long it will be." But the manager offered no estimation, just that smug expression that said he wanted them to leave. James felt it boiling in his gut, that sense of outrage that he'd taught about all his life. Biases, microaggressions, and the subtle humiliations that too many people face daily. He stared at the manager's face, trying to recall if he'd ever seen him in a classroom decades back, or if this kind of smug bigotry was simply a universal archetype that popped up everywhere. "Why don't we just go somewhere else, Dad?" Lisa whispered, defeat creeping into her tone. She didn't want to keep fighting for a table they had every right to. James hesitated. He hated giving in to something that felt so brazenly unfair. But before he could respond, the manager, perhaps sensing victory, clapped his hands once in a condescending gesture. "Yes, that might be best," he said. "We wouldn't want your evening to be ruined waiting around." There was an undercurrent of sneer in his voice that James couldn't ignore. "Sure," James said quietly, turning toward the door. "Let's just—" But he trailed off when he saw Jordan's eyes brimming with frustration. The teenager looked up at his grandfather, then turned that frustration on the manager. "Why do you hate us?" Jordan asked, voice trembling slightly. "Is it because we're black?" The hostess gasped, the manager's face paled, and a hush fell across the entrance. That question, so direct, so blunt, hung in the air with a finality that made everyone freeze. People waiting nearby looked on. A wealthy-looking couple that had just been seated glanced over with mild curiosity. The manager broke the silence with a dismissive laugh. "That's an outrageous accusation," he said, but the forced chuckle did little to hide his discomfort. Jordan's mouth tightened. "Then why is this happening?" he asked, voice wavering. "Why are we the only ones not allowed to sit?" Lisa opened her mouth to calm Jordan, but her son's raw indignation was the voice she wished she could muster herself. The manager raised a hand as though he could swat the accusations aside. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "We simply had a scheduling issue." Jordan refused to back down. "A scheduling issue that only affects us." The teenager's directness stunned James a little, but he felt a surge of pride. He taught his grandson to stand up for what's right, even if it meant challenging authority. The manager, however, was not impressed. His face darkened and he glared at them. "If you keep causing a scene," he began, "I'll have to ask you to leave." And that was when James knew there was no more doubt. This man was beyond reason or civility. Lisa grabbed Jordan's hand, ready to walk out, until another commotion by the door drew their attention. A tall, composed figure walked in, a man in his mid-50s, wearing a tailored suit that fit him so impeccably it had to be custom-made. He had an aura of authority that made people step aside without him even asking. He paused the moment he entered, glancing around the foyer as if he could sense the tension in the air. Lisa's eyes widened. She recognized him from business news segments she'd seen on television. "That's Matthew Ellison," she whispered to James. "He's the CEO of this entire chain of restaurants." Sure enough, the manager, who had been so smug moments ago, suddenly straightened. His eyes flickered with panic. He put on the brightest smile he could muster, hurrying toward the CEO. "Mr. Ellison," he said, voice pitchy with nerves, "we weren't expecting you tonight." The CEO nodded curtly, not returning the smile. He glanced at James, then at the manager, his gaze cool and assessing. "I was supposed to have dinner with an investor," he said, "but I decided to drop by unannounced." He looked at Lisa and Jordan, then at James, who stood quietly watching the exchange. "Is there a problem here?" the CEO asked, his tone making it clear he expected a direct answer. The manager forced another big smile, and waved a hand dismissively. "Just a little mix-up, that's all," he said. "This party was late for their reservation, and we were just trying to figure out how to fit them in." James stayed silent for a moment, wondering if he should speak up. But Lisa wasted no time. She pulled up the confirmation email yet again. "We were literally 3 minutes late," she said firmly. "And my father was here even before we arrived." The CEO looked at the manager, eyebrow raised. "So if he was already here, why was their table given away?" The manager's face reddened, and the hostess seemed to shrink behind him. "Mr. Ellison," she stammered, we must have made a mistake. It got very busy." James studied the CEO, noticing that something in the man's expression had shifted. He seemed almost personally invested, as though he recognized James from somewhere. James found it odd until the CEO took a step toward him, studying his face. "Professor Carter?" the CEO said, sounding surprised. "You taught a course I took in undergrad, nearly 30 years ago." James tilted his head, searching his memory. Matthew Ellison, the name rang a faint bell. "I did teach a Matthew Ellison," James said carefully. "But that was so long ago." The CEO nodded, a half-smile forming. "You changed my perspective on a lot of things," he said. "I can't believe it's you." The manager blinked, caught completely off guard. "Oh, well, that's interesting," he said, his voice filled with strain as he tried to maintain a polite front. "Maybe we can seat them now, yes?" The CEO's eyes narrowed, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. He turned to look at the manager fully. "Why weren't they seated in the first place?" The question hung in the air, an accusation in itself. The manager swallowed hard, clearly trying to come up with a believable excuse. We had some confusion. There was another party with a similar name." At that moment, the waiter who had been cleaning a table earlier ventured closer. He spoke softly, his voice trembling slightly because he was clearly risking his job by interjecting. "Actually, sir," he addressed the CEO, "they were here on time. The manager told the hostess not to seat them." A hush fell again. The manager whipped around toward the waiter, anger and betrayal etched on his face. "You keep out of this," he snapped. But the CEO raised a hand, silencing the manager. "Is that true?" he asked the waiter. The young man swallowed and nodded, stepping forward. "Yes, sir. This happens sometimes. There's let's just say, a sort of policy here, unofficially, about who gets priority seating." Lisa let out a disgusted scoff, while James closed his eyes, pained by the confirmation of what he'd suspected. The CEO inhaled sharply, turning a cold gaze on the manager, who now looked like a cornered animal. "I want the truth," the CEO demanded. "Have you been turning away certain customers based on some misguided notion of who belongs and who doesn't?" The manager stammered. "That's not how I'd put it, sir. We have standards. This restaurant is about exclusivity. We can't just seat everyone who walks in." The CEO's voice reverberated, low and threatening. "Everyone who makes a valid reservation," he corrected. "You do seat everyone who makes a reservation, unless they fail to show." These people did show. So why, exactly, were they not seated? The manager's eyes darted around, looking for an escape. He seemed to understand that any lie he told could be disproven by the waitstaff or by the growing crowd of customers who had witnessed the entire scene. Meanwhile, passers-by were pulling out phones, recording snippets of the confrontation. Jordan noticed that and felt a flicker of satisfaction. At least there would be some proof if the manager tried to lie. Finally, the manager's shoulders sagged in defeat. "I might have told the hostess to hold the table," he admitted grudgingly. "But it's not because of racism. It's just that sometimes older people, they don't spend as much. And well, we have a strict dining policy for premium tables. We can't keep them free for too long, or we lose money." Even as he said the words, it sounded absurd. Lisa let out a bitter laugh. "So you think an older black man won't spend money at your fancy restaurant?" The manager opened his mouth to retort, but the CEO held up a hand, silencing him. "I've heard enough," the CEO said, his voice taut with anger. He turned to James with an expression of genuine regret. "Professor Carter, I'm sorry you were treated this way. I would like to personally invite you and your family to dine here tonight, on the house. But before that, I have to deal with something." He turned his attention fully to the manager, who swallowed hard. "You do not represent what this restaurant stands for," the CEO said, voice echoing in the now silent foyer. "You think you can turn away paying customers because of your prejudices, and you think this is acceptable in my establishment?" The manager tried one more time to protest. "Sir, I promise, it was just a misunderstanding. We can't let everyone in, and if people aren't up to the standard..." But he never finished. The CEO's glare could have melted steel. "You are fired," he said, each word punctuated with resolve. "Pack up your things and get out. Effective immediately." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. The hostess paled, looking terrified that she might be next. The manager's face flashed red with rage. You can't just. But the CEO cut him off, raising his voice so everyone could hear. I can and I will. Your behavior is a liability to this restaurant and to our brand. Now leave. The manager's fury was evident, but with all eyes on him, and the cameras rolling, he had no choice but to comply. He muttered curses under his breath, storming out past customers who stared at him with disdain. A hush fell in the aftermath. The CEO turned to James, exhaling. I'm really sorry, he said more quietly now. I never intended for any of my establishments to discriminate against anyone. Let me make this right. The hostility that had filled James moments earlier drained away, replaced by relief and a lingering sense of disbelief that such a swift and public resolution had occurred. Lisa looked at her father, and James nodded slowly. We appreciate this, he said softly. And for what it's worth, I remember you too, Mr. Ellison. You were a dedicated student. The CEO smiled, though there was a sadness behind it. Apparently I still have more to learn about who I hire, he said. He glanced at the hostess, who was quivering by the podium. As for you, he said gently, but firmly, I suggest you rethink how you treat customers, no matter who they are. I'll be discussing your future here with HR. The hostess's face fell, and she stammered an apology to James, Lisa, and Jordan. I'm so sorry, she said in a quiet voice. James only nodded, not quite ready to forgive but willing to let it rest for the moment. The CEO personally escorted them inside, leading them to the most elegant table in the restaurant. The dining room was tastefully decorated with crystal chandeliers, cream-colored linens, and soft candlelight. Many patrons watched them pass, some with curiosity, others with relief, clearly aware that justice had been done. A buzz of conversation followed them, and James could sense that word of the confrontation had already spread. As they settled into their seats, the CEO beckoned the head waiter. Take good care of them, he instructed. Anything they need is on me. The head waiter nodded respectfully, handing out menus. Jordan, who had been quiet in the last few minutes, spoke up, looking at his grandfather. You okay? He asked softly. James nodded, but there was a heaviness in his chest that hadn't quite dissipated. He'd come to celebrate a birthday, not to wage a battle. Still, he was grateful that someone in power had stepped in and taken immediate, decisive action. It didn't erase the humiliation, but it did offer a measure of vindication. Lisa was still shaken. She kept glancing over at the door, as though expecting the fired manager to burst back in. Dad, she said quietly, maybe we should go somewhere else anyway. I'm not sure I can enjoy this place now. But James gently patted her hand. Let's stay, he said. We have every right to be here. Let's celebrate, for Jordan's sake too. The boy nodded, trying to process all the emotions coursing through him: anger, relief, pride, and confusion. The CEO looked at them, a sincere glimmer in his eyes. I hope you'll stay. I'd really like to talk with you after dinner if that's all right. James offered a small smile. Sure, he said. We'll talk. The CEO took a step back, then went to make a quick phone call, likely to inform the rest of his leadership team about what had just happened. Meanwhile, the staff, now minus the manager, moved with urgent energy, offering bread baskets, pouring water, and trying to undo the damage that had been done earlier. James noticed that some customers were eyeing them with approving smiles. One couple even raised their glasses slightly in a silent gesture of solidarity. Jordan nudged his grandfather. People are recording us, he whispered, nodding toward a few phones aimed discreetly in their direction. James sighed. Let them. Maybe it'll hold people accountable. Lisa, still tense, turned her attention to the menu, her hands trembling slightly. Let's just order, she murmured. Maybe we can find some peace in a good meal. James forced a faint laugh. That's the spirit, he said, trying to lighten the atmosphere. Deep down, though, he could feel his stomach churning with the residue of humiliation, along with a strange sense of triumph that the manager had been caught in public. He leaned over to Jordan, whispering, "I'm proud of you for speaking up." Jordan nodded, his eyes shining. "I just couldn't let them talk to you like that," he said, voice thick with emotion. "No one should treat you like that." James squeezed his grandson's hand, thankful for the support and for the younger generation's refusal to stay silent. When the bread arrived, fresh and warm, Lisa tried to break off a piece but paused, clearly still rattled by everything. James noticed the tears glistening in her eyes. "You don't have to hold it in," he said gently. She glanced around, saw the concerned gazes of a few diners, then took a deep breath. "I'm okay," she insisted, though her voice quivered. "I just hate seeing this happen to you, Dad." James reached for her hand. "I've faced worse," he said, his voice quiet. "But it never gets easier. Sometimes it gets more subtle, sometimes it's blatant, but it always stings." Lisa lowered her gaze, thinking of the times she'd witnessed discrimination, both small and large, throughout her own life. She felt a surge of gratitude that at least her son was learning to push back, not to internalize this ugliness. "We'll get through it," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Jordan remained silent, staring at the flickering candle on the table. The entire experience had shaken him, and James could see that the boy was trying to process it all. As they began to place orders, filet mignon for James, a delicate salmon dish for Lisa, and a hearty pasta for Jordan, an undercurrent of tension still lingered. Every so often, James glanced around, making eye contact with onlookers. He saw empathy on some faces, curiosity on others, and a quiet agreement on many more. It was as though everyone recognized that a line had been crossed tonight. In that awareness, James found a strange comfort. These strangers were witnessing a truth that often went unseen. Soon enough, the CEO returned, quietly taking a seat at a table close by, but not intruding on their family moment. He gave them space, allowing them to eat in relative peace. A few staff members approached with complimentary sparkling cider, toasting James for his birthday. It felt surreal. Just an hour ago, he'd been treated like an unwelcome intruder. Now he was being celebrated. The shift was almost too much to process at once. Eventually, the meal began to banish the tension. Lisa found herself savoring the flavors, though bitterness still lingered on her tongue from the earlier conflict. She looked at her father, who was cutting into his steak with methodical calm. "Dad," she said softly, "you sure you're all right?" James paused, nodding. "I'm okay," he replied, giving her a faint smile. "I'm trying to be, anyway. Thank you for standing up for me, you and Jordan." Lisa blinked back tears, and Jordan, still quiet, just nodded solemnly. The boy was shaped by this experience in ways he likely didn't fully understand yet. He had learned that speaking truth to power could yield results, but he also saw the ugliness that made such confrontation necessary. As they continued their meal, the hush that had settled over the restaurant gradually returned to the usual hum of conversation and clinking silverware. People resumed their own dinners, though many still shot glances at James's table, seemingly checking if everything was now okay. The staff, for their part, went above and beyond. The head waiter came by frequently, asking if they needed anything. They offered them complimentary desserts, and made sure the bread basket was never empty. By the time they were finishing their entrees, James's shoulders felt less tense. He actually began enjoying his steak, though the memory of the manager's hateful stance still shadowed his thoughts. He appreciated the quiet strength and dignity Lisa and Jordan had shown, and the direct, decisive action of the CEO. He couldn't say the humiliation was forgotten, but he felt some measure of closure. Near the end of the meal, Matthew Ellison, who had been speaking with a few other staff members, approached their table again. He cleared his throat politely. "Professor Carter," he said, "I just wanted to thank you for your patience tonight. If it's all right with you, I'd like to speak for a moment after you're finished." James looked at Lisa and Jordan, who both nodded. "Of course," James said. "We'll be done soon." The CEO offered a polite dip of his head. "No rush. Take your time. And happy birthday." With that, he stepped away, leaving them to finish in privacy. Jordan, noticing the tension had dissipated somewhat, finally allowed himself to relish the pasta. Lisa watched her son with a mixture of pride and sorrow, knowing he just witnessed how cruel the world could be, yet also how one person's power could shift the entire scenario. She only hoped that the takeaway for Jordan was a sense that justice could be served, not just that injustice existed. Dessert arrived in the form of a beautifully plated chocolate soufflé and a tangy citrus tart. Normally, James would have grinned like a child at the sight of such elegant sweets. He had a notable sweet tooth, but he ate them with a kind of reserved gratitude tonight. He was still processing the abrupt swings of fortune. The manager's dismissal had been swift and startling, but perhaps that was the only way to handle someone who felt so comfortable discriminating in plain sight. As the last bites were taken, the CEO approached once more, gently asking if they had time to talk. Lisa nodded, and Jordan whispered to James that he'd be okay waiting, so James rose carefully, following Matthew Ellison to a quieter corner near the window. Lisa decided to stay at the table with Jordan to give her father space. The two men stood by the large window, the skyline glittering behind them. For a moment, they just looked at each other, both remembering the teacher-student dynamic from so many years ago. The CEO offered a small smile. "I meant what I said. You changed my worldview back then. Your lectures on equality, on the importance of fairness, they stuck with me," he said quietly. "I just never expected to see you again under these circumstances." James nodded, still composed. "Life has a way of surprising us," he replied. Matthew sighed, running a hand over his trimmed hair. "I can't apologize enough. It's my responsibility to ensure that the culture in these restaurants." He paused, searching for the right words. "I had no idea that kind of discrimination was happening under my nose." James considered him, recalling the quieter, studious young man who sat in the back row of his lecture hall all those years ago. "That's the thing about discrimination," James said gently. "It often hides in plain sight, only surfacing when someone is willing to speak up or when a target is unwilling to walk away. If we hadn't spoken up, you'd never know." Matthew nodded. "That's what bothers me the most," he said. "How many others turned away quietly and never returned? How many times has this happened?" His gaze dropped to the floor. "I plan to do a full investigation, figure out if there are others on the staff who share that manager's mindset. I'm serious about making changes." James appreciated the sincerity in his tone. "I believe you," he said. "But change won't happen if it ends with one firing. It has to be systemic." Matthew's eyes flicked up, determination glinting. "I understand," he replied. "We'll conduct anti-discrimination training. We'll reevaluate hiring practices. If there's a pattern, I'll root it out." They spoke for a few more minutes, the conversation bridging the gap between past and present. James recalled anecdotes from his old classroom, times when Matthew had asked insightful questions about structural bias. It was surreal, standing here in a fancy restaurant, acknowledging that the real world was still grappling with the same issues. Finally, Matthew extended his hand. "Thank you for not walking away tonight. I'm going to make this right," he said. James shook the offered hand. "I hope so," he replied. "And if you need any advice, well, I might be retired, but I'm always willing to share what I've learned." The two parted ways with a sense of mutual respect. James returned to the table, where Lisa and Jordan were waiting. Their meals were finished, and Lisa was helping Jordan with a bit of French homework on the side while they waited. They both looked up expectantly as James approached. "Everything okay?" Lisa asked. James nodded, placing a gentle hand on Jordan's shoulder. "Yes," he said. "He seems genuine. Maybe this will be a turning point for him, and for this restaurant." Jordan exhaled, relief evident on his features. "I hope so," he said. "I'm glad we stayed." A moment later, the head waiter came by to clear their plates, offering them each a gift card for a future meal as a small token of apology. James accepted it politely, though he wasn't sure he'd ever return. Sometimes, a single traumatic event can taint a place for you forever. But he didn't want to diminish the significance of the CEO's actions. He thanked the waiter quietly, noticing the man looked relieved that the situation had been resolved so decisively. Other staff members were clearly trying to be on their best behavior now, not wanting to cause any further scene. After paying their respects to the CEO and bidding him farewell, James, Lisa, and Jordan made their way toward the exit. The same hostess was standing by the podium, her face drawn with worry. She murmured another apology as they passed. James studied her expression for a moment. Perhaps she wasn't a bad person at her core, but she had followed orders from a man who wielded authority over her, or she'd harbored her own biases without questioning them. James simply gave her a small nod, neither absolving nor condemning her, before stepping outside into the crisp evening air. As they stood on the sidewalk, James inhaled deeply, feeling the night breeze on his face. Lisa looped an arm through his. "Ready to go home, Dad?" she asked softly. He gave a tired smile. "Yes, but let's do something fun this weekend. A real celebration, just the three of us, no drama." Jordan perked up at that. "Like a picnic or something?" James considered it. "A picnic could be nice. Or a small diner with good coffee and pie. No reservations needed." Lisa and Jordan chuckled softly. It was a subdued but genuine moment of lightness after all the tension. They began walking down the sidewalk, passing by the large windows of the restaurant, seeing other diners enjoying their meals, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded. But James knew many people had witnessed it, and more still would see it on social media, courtesy of those phone recordings. Word would spread. Maybe it would shine a light on the discrimination that lurked in high-end establishments. Maybe some other managers would think twice before turning away someone they deemed undesirable. One could hope. James paused at the corner, glancing back briefly. Through the window, he saw Matthew Ellison watching them depart. The CEO lifted a hand in a small wave. James returned the gesture, feeling a mixture of sadness and hope. The sadness was for all the times in his life he hadn't been able to fight back or hadn't been heard, and the hope was for moments like these, when justice, however small, could be done in the open. They continued walking, Lisa and Jordan sharing the sidewalk with him, talking about the meal, the bizarre turn of events, and the startling power of speaking up. Jordan asked, "Grandpa, do you think that manager will ever change his mind about people?" James sighed. "I don't know," he admitted. "He might just blame everyone else for what happened. Change can't be forced on someone who won't accept it." Lisa looked over at him, her face set. "At least he won't be able to do that to other families in that restaurant," she said, and James nodded. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "Sometimes that's the best we can achieve." They reached the parking lot where Lisa had left her car, and all three piled in. As they fastened their seatbelts, Lisa turned the key in the ignition, and the engine hummed to life. None of them spoke immediately. They were still recovering from the whirlwind of emotions. Finally, Jordan broke the silence. "I'm proud of you, Grandpa," he said, his voice soft. "And I'm proud of you, Mom. You both stood up for what's right." Lisa reached over to tousle his hair affectionately. "You did too," she said. "You asked the question that needed to be asked?" James nodded in agreement, remembering how Jordan's direct question, "Is it because we're black?" had cut through all the manager's pretenses. "You spoke truth to power," James said to his grandson. "That's not always an easy thing to do, but it's necessary." They drove off into the night, streetlights passing in a rhythmic glow, each one illuminating the interior of the car for a moment. James reflected on how quickly a simple birthday dinner turned into a battle against discrimination. He wondered if he should have pressed charges or made a formal complaint, but seeing the manager fired on the spot felt like enough of a statement. He also knew the CEO's vow to investigate further gave the potential for lasting change. That was more than he could have hoped for when he first noticed the hostess's dismissive attitude. The hum of the engine and the soft patter of tires on asphalt lulled them into a reflective silence. Lisa eventually pulled into the driveway of James's home, a cozy single-story house with a well-kept yard. They said their goodnights, and James gave Jordan an extra tight hug before they parted. The evening had brought them closer in a way, forging a bond of resilience. James stepped inside and locked the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment in the quiet darkness of his living room. He took off his shoes and walked to the small lamp by his recliner, flicking it on. Warm light filled the space. On a shelf nearby was a photo of him as a younger man, arm around his late wife, with Lisa as a toddler on his knee. He picked it up, remembering how they had dreamed of a future where their daughter wouldn't face the prejudices they had. Yet here he was, decades later, dealing with the same old problem. Perhaps there had been progress, but nights like these reminded him that prejudice was still alive, coiled just beneath the surface. Setting the photo down, he sank into his recliner and closed his eyes. His thoughts lingered on Matthew Ellison, the once quiet student who had grown up to be a powerful CEO. There was a small comfort in knowing that the seeds James had planted in that classroom so many years ago might have contributed to the swift justice he'd witnessed tonight. In a world often indifferent to injustice, that was something worth holding on to. Meanwhile, in the car on the way to their own home, Lisa and Jordan were still decompressing. "Mom," Jordan asked, "why didn't we just walk out the moment they treated Grandpa like that?" Lisa thought about it, hands gripping the steering wheel. "Because we had every right to be there," she said. "Sometimes you fight back by refusing to be pushed away. Sometimes you fight by refusing to be silent." Jordan nodded, letting that sink in. "Do you think the story will go viral?" he asked, half hopeful, half anxious. Lisa shrugged. "Maybe. But whether it does or not, we stood up for ourselves. And we got an apology from the person in charge, which is huge." Jordan fiddled with his phone. He'd recorded part of the confrontation earlier, though it was probably shaky and incomplete. "Should I post it?" he asked. Lisa weighed the pros and cons. On the one hand, it could spark a broader conversation about discrimination. On the other, it might invite trolls and negativity. But in the end, she said, "If you do, make sure you're ready for whatever comes. But I won't stop you." Jordan gazed at the screen, uncertain. "I might wait," he decided, "until we've all had time to process." In the following days, however, it turned out they didn't need to post their own footage. Other diners who had recorded the incident uploaded it online, and it quickly gained traction. News sites picked it up, praising the CEO's quick action and calling attention to the blatant discrimination. James's name and face weren't plastered everywhere. Most who shared the video respected his privacy and simply referred to him as an elderly black man. But for those who recognized him, or who found out his identity, there was an outpouring of support. Former students emailed him, referencing the old lectures they remembered, lauding him for standing firm in his convictions even years after retirement. He was humbled by the attention but also weary. He didn't like the idea that a viral video of a humiliating moment was what it took to spark conversation. Still, if it raised awareness and pressured other establishments to examine their biases, maybe some good would come of it. Inside Maison Lauror, changes were already underway. The hostess was placed on probation, required to attend new training programs. A thorough audit of seating policies took place, and the staff who had either witnessed or participated in discriminatory practices were either reprimanded or dismissed. Matthew Ellison took a personal interest in ensuring that new guidelines were communicated at every branch of the chain. He even reached out to James via email, asking for any recommendations on organizations or experts to consult to make the training truly impactful. James spent a thoughtful afternoon drafting a reply, suggesting names of civil rights groups and diversity consultants he respected. It felt strange to be pulled out of retirement for something like this, but he recognized the opportunity for real change. If his small act of defiance could help shape a better corporate culture, then maybe the indignity he suffered wasn't in vain. Days became weeks, and the memory of that night settled into James's mind as a bittersweet reminder that progress was never linear. He reflected on the fact that the manager had felt so comfortable discriminating in front of other customers. It highlighted the complacency that still existed in society. But the immediate pushback from Lisa, Jordan, and ultimately the CEO also highlighted that a new generation, and some enlightened members of older ones, would no longer tolerate such blatant prejudice. Late one afternoon, James sat on a park bench with Jordan, sharing an ice cream as they often did. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grass. Jordan had just finished basketball practice and was telling James about an upcoming school project. After a lull in the conversation, Jordan asked, "Grandpa, would you do anything different if you could relive that night at the restaurant?" James took a moment to consider. "Honestly," he said, "maybe I would have been more direct from the start. But mostly I think we did the right thing by speaking up and not letting it slide." Jordan nodded thoughtfully. "I just hate that it happened," he admitted. "You didn't deserve that." James patted his grandson's shoulder. "No one does," he said. "But remember, it's what we do in those moments that defines us. You found the courage to speak. That means you're part of the solution." For his part, the CEO upheld his promises. Over the next few months, he reached out occasionally to James, updating him on policy changes and staff retraining outcomes. It wasn't James's responsibility to oversee it all, but the CEO insisted that he appreciated any guidance James could provide. While James remained cautious, not wanting to be used as a simple public relations token, he was gratified to see genuine effort. He saw pictures of newly posted codes of conduct, staff seminars about unconscious bias, and even a scholarship program for minority students interested in culinary arts, something Matthew Ellison said was inspired by James's teachings. The official announcements also clarified that any staff found violating these principles would face immediate termination. It was a strong stand, and one that might deter future acts of discrimination. News outlets occasionally picked up these developments, framing the narrative as a redemption story for the restaurant chain. James found the coverage interesting, especially the commentators who debated whether the CEO's actions were too harsh or just right. To James, there was no question that the manager had to go. His conduct was indefensible. The only debate worth having was how to prevent such people from rising to positions of power in the first place. Months after the incident, James received an invitation to speak at a diversity and inclusion conference sponsored by the chain. He was reluctant at first, unsure if he wanted to be thrust back into the spotlight, but Lisa encouraged him, and Jordan was ecstatic at the idea. "Grandpa, you always said you wanted to keep teaching in some way," Jordan reminded him. So, eventually, James accepted. Standing behind a podium in a modest event hall, he shared his experiences and insights with an audience of business leaders, employees, and community members. Matthew Ellison introduced him as the professor who had impacted his worldview many years ago. James's talk emphasized personal responsibility, empathy, and the crucial role of speaking out against injustice. He recounted the humiliating night at Maison Lauror without naming the fired manager, focusing instead on the broader lessons learned. Lisa and Jordan sat in the front row, beaming with pride, applauding when James finished. After the speech, people came up to shake his hand, thanking him for his candor and for shining a light on an uncomfortable reality. Some employees admitted they'd never considered how small actions could make someone feel unwelcome or lesser. A few even confessed to standing by silently in similar situations out of fear of confrontation. James urged them all to look at the cost of silence versus the cost of speaking up. Silence enables bigotry, he told them. Courage disarms it. Over time, the memory of that painful evening merged with the memory of what came after: real change, heartfelt apologies, and a renewed sense of purpose for James. When his next birthday rolled around, Lisa gently asked him if he'd like to go back to Maison Lauror, now under new management, to see the improvements firsthand. James gave it some thought but ultimately decided on a simpler place, a local diner where he and Lisa used to go when she was a child. It wasn't glamorous or exclusive, but the people there greeted him with warmth, calling him by name. There was never a question of whether he belonged. That sense of belonging, James realized, was the opposite of humiliation. It was the feeling every human being deserves, no matter their age, race, or social standing. And while he appreciated the steps the CEO took to correct the wrongdoing, he treasured even more the everyday acts of kindness he encountered in unpretentious spaces, places that welcomed him without making a show of it. It was the kind of atmosphere he'd like Jordan to inherit in every corner of society. On that second birthday, the three of them, James, Lisa, and Jordan, sat in a worn booth with red vinyl seats, laughing and reminiscing as they enjoyed hamburgers and milkshakes. Jordan brought up the events of the previous year, how they went from humiliation to triumph in one night. "It was scary," Jordan admitted, "but I'm glad we didn't back down." James nodded in agreement, biting into a fry. "Sometimes the scariest moments are the ones that change everything," he said, smiling at his grandson. "And you changed everything the moment you spoke the truth out loud." Lisa raised her glass. "To speaking the truth," she said, and they clinked their milkshakes in a soft toast. Outside, the sky was bright, the day was peaceful, and the world seemed just a little bit kinder for a moment. James thought of how far he'd come in his 73 years, how the fight for equality was far from over, yet how every small victory mattered. He savored the moment, grateful for the progress made, even if it was overdue and imperfect. When they finished their meal, the waitress, someone who'd known James and Lisa for years, refused to let them pay. "It's on the house," she insisted, winking at James. "Consider it a birthday gift and a thank you for all those times you helped my nephew with his history assignments." James laughed, touched by the gesture. This, he thought, is how a community should feel, people helping each other, caring for each other, and acknowledging one another's worth without question. It was a stark contrast to the stifling air of elitism they'd encountered at the restaurant chain before the CEO stepped in. As they left the diner, James felt a quiet sense of resolution. Not every story would have such a turnaround. Not every act of discrimination would result in a dramatic confrontation with a high-powered CEO riding in to dispense justice. But this time it had. For once, the system had worked swiftly to correct a wrong, and that was a memory worth holding onto. It reminded him that progress often crept forward on the shoulders of individuals brave enough to say, "Enough is enough." In the weeks that followed, James kept in sporadic contact with Matthew Ellison, who sent him occasional updates on policy changes and training outcomes. It seemed the chain was genuinely trying to overhaul its culture. They were working with advocacy groups, funneling funds into community outreach programs, and making sure that employees at every level were aware of the company's zero-tolerance stance on discrimination. Some critics accused the CEO of overreacting, but James believed that in matters of prejudice, it was better to overcorrect than to do nothing. The last time they spoke, Matthew told James that some former employees had reached out, complaining that they'd been wrongfully terminated. The CEO simply said he reviewed the evidence and found that many of them had either ignored or actively participated in discriminatory behavior. James told him not to waver. "Fairness is not an overreaction," he reminded the CEO. "It's what should have been there all along." By then, Lisa and Jordan had moved on too, returning to everyday life, soccer practice, homework, family dinners. But the memory of that night remained a shared experience that shaped them. Jordan grew more confident in speaking up when he saw injustice, and Lisa found herself less willing to accept casual slights in her own workplace. Even James noticed that he carried himself with a bit more resolve, knowing that age hadn't taken away his ability to stand firm for what was right. Every so often, Jordan would ask about the old days, how James had once marched for civil rights, how he taught classes on social justice, how he always believed education was the key to empathy. James would share stories, some uplifting, some heartbreaking, and remind Jordan that their generation's fight was just the next step in a relay. "Carry the torch," he would say. "Don't let it go out. Make sure each generation behind you sees that light." In the end, that humiliating night at Maison Lauror did more than ruin a birthday dinner. It sparked a series of events that exposed the ugliness lurking in the shadows of a prestigious establishment, leading to change at the highest level of management. It taught a teenage boy the power of naming injustice, and it reinforced in an elderly professor that his legacy of teaching was still alive and well, even outside the classroom walls. It was a reminder to everyone watching that sometimes, the swiftest form of justice comes when people of conscience, regardless of status, refuse to look away. And while James could never erase the sting of that initial refusal, He could take solace in the knowledge that speaking up had made a difference, if not for himself, then for those who might come after him, walking into a restaurant with the simple hope of enjoying a meal without prejudice. If one person saw his story and felt emboldened to challenge discrimination, or if one employer revisited their policies to ensure fairness, then the humiliation he suffered that night was not in vain. It became a catalyst for change, a spark of light in a dark corner. And that, James realized, was worth all the discomfort of bringing the truth into the open.